the difference between this presentation and what else you've heard is, this is about what we should do right now. This is not going to solve the problem. This is the essential first step. Now, the question is, why do you want to put a price on carbon? And I think the previous speakers have made it pretty clear. First of all, greenhouse gases cause global warming, and global warming is an existential threat to life as we know it, not to the planet, but to life as we know it. Burning fossil fuels is by far the greatest source of the greenhouse gases that are causing this problem. The problem is that the full cost of fossil fuel energy is not included in the price of the fuel. We pay for that later, and we pay for that separately. And that's why we have to raise the price of coal, oil, and gas. And because if we raise the price of the coal, oil, and gas, we will put the market on the side of fixing the problem. And then all the other things, solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, and nuclear, will be competitively advantaged because the other things because the fossil fuel energy will be relatively more expensive. So the question then becomes, how do you put a price on fossil fuel? And there really are two methods. One is cap and trade. And what cap and trade does is make a decision about how much CO2 we're willing to tolerate, require licensing to burn the fossil fuels that will emit that CO2, set the number of licenses based on the amount of CO2 you're willing to accept, and then the people who want to burn it have to bid for the licenses. Carbon tax, so you don't know, when you do cap and trade, you don't know how much you're going to increase the price of the fossil fuel. It's going to depend on a market. The second thing you can simply do is tax fossil fuels. And if you tax fossil fuels, you have certainty about the pricing. You know how much you're adding to the cost of the fossil fuels. But you don't know exactly how much that's going to reduce the emissions. So the advantage to cap and trade is you're after the right objective, which is controlling the emissions. The advantage of taxing fossil fuels instead is it's clearer. It's easier to understand. The question is, now the taxing of the fossil fuels based on emissions is because we know how much CO2 will come from a certain amount of coal or a certain amount of oil or a certain amount of gas. So we tax based on the CO2 that's going to be emitted by that volume of fossil fuels. You try to capture that money when the fossil fuel enters the economy. So that could be at the wellhead, it could be at the port, it could be at the mine. There are some plans for this that instead do the taxing in wholesale channels. The main point is, however you apply the tax or the fee, you have raised the price of the fossil fuel, and you've therefore incented someone to use something else to get their energy. Now, these are the trade-offs when you choose. As I was saying, cap and trade provides greater emission certainty, which is desirable, and unpredictable pricing, which is not desirable. Carbon taxing provides predictable pricing, but you don't know exactly what the results will be. But the big problem with cap and trade is it's a lot more complicated to administer, because you have a multi-step process by which you've decided how much CO2 you're allowing, and then you translate that into how many permits you'll have, and then you have people applying for the permits, and that's the only way you determine the price. And that's made me come down on the side of taxing carbon rather than cap and trade, although I just want to get rid of the CO2. I mean, I'm willing to accept a lot of compromise. How the price is calculated, okay? The way these things are expressed is in dollars per ton of CO2 that's produced by the fuel. Coal pollutes the most, oil pollutes less than coal, and gas is controversial because there is methane, which is pound for pound worse than CO2 for a shorter period of time. which is released when gas is fracked and mined. And one of the problems at the moment is that people who are concerned about the impacts of fracking have taken the position of banning fracking. The thing we need to do is measure the amount of methane that is being released. This is not being reported to us. We really have no idea what it is. And there are no incentives for the oil companies or the frackers to reduce the methane that results from their getting the gas. And part of the problem is that allies, people who should be on our side managing the methane, are so busy opposing gas that they're not participating in the real solvable problem, which is to control it much more effectively than we do. But in fact, the US has reduced its carbon footprint as we measure it because of the substitution of gas for coal. That is real, and that's been the story of the last 10 years, and it's a story which is elided a lot in the conversation. So the big question, if you do this, I mean, a lot of people are in favor of taxing fossil fuels. There's a lot of people who understand the concept of the economic externalities, that the fossil fuels are creating costs, and we're not accounting for that cost. But then if you tax the fossil fuels, or if you sell licenses, either way, what do you do with the money? Well, there are roughly 4 things that are competing for the use of the money. Climate justice. Climate justice is basically the concept that the poorest people pay the highest price for the damage that we're doing to the economy. The poorest people live in the most polluted neighborhoods. They breathe the most polluted air. And so there's a substantial constituency that says that the money that we collect from doing this should be addressed to alleviating climate justice. The second place that people want to spend the money is on building up renewables. You tax the carbon and you buy windmills with it. That seems like a very logical solution. The third way of dealing with it is what's called tax swaps. And tax swaps are, we've taxed the carbon, so because we've taxed the carbon, we can cut income taxes, or we can cut property taxes, or we can cut some other kind of taxes. And the fourth way, which is the way I like, is dividends. And the concept of dividends is that you take the money that you get from carbon taxing and you give it back to people in equal shares. And that way, people are getting a regular check that reminds them that carbon is being taxed, and they can avoid contributing to the pot that gave them that check if they don't buy fossil fuels. So on the one hand, you discourage people from buying them, and on the other hand, you compensate people for the tax. Now, I'll get back to the advantages of that later in this piece, but there's another aspect of this which David touched on very briefly when he mentioned the concept of drawdown. The problem, as has been elaborated by several speakers here, is we're already past the danger point. I don't know how many of you know an organization, I take it, called 350.org. This is where 350.org got its name. The man who created it, Bill McKibben, wanted to know 30 years ago, at what point in parts per million of carbon are we in danger? So he went to Jim Hansen, who is the climate scientist who really alerted us to all of this in 1988 and is the hero of the climate movement. And they said to Hansen, at what point is it dangerous? And Hansen said, 350. If we get 350 parts per million, that's all we can deal with. And that's why he named his organization 350.org. Well, as the charts have shown you earlier, we're at 414, 415. The Earth has never been at 415 during human existence. It's very doubtful that humans can live forever in an environment that's 415. Oh, by the way, 415 and going up. So it's not sufficient to stop putting CO2 into the atmosphere, because the CO2 we've got in the atmosphere will remain for thousands of years. We have to find ways to take CO2 out. And so there is technology that's being developed to do that, and the idea is, again, as David touched on, is if you get this carbon deep enough into the ground, it can bond with rock in the ground and become permanently fixed and no longer our problem. So that's the sequestration part of carbon capture and sequestration. So there are essentially two ways to do this. One is, as you're burning the carbon, you can capture the smoke, and carbon dioxide is carbon and oxygen, and the oxygen's perfectly useful, and you capture the carbon and you somehow bury or sequester the carbon. But the other thing, but that's not good enough, because that's only stopping the additional carbon from the fossil fuels you're burning today. We have to get carbon out. And getting carbon out is done in a number of ways, and it can actually be pulled out of the air. But here's the joker. It takes energy to do that. It requires energy to sequester carbon. Now, what you have to do, obviously, is get the energy in ways that doesn't require you to burn more carbon. What we're looking at is powering sequestration with solar energy or wind energy or some other kind of energy. We can live with energy that is intermittent for that purpose, but we really don't want to burn fossil fuels to solve the problem of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. I think it's worth talking about the politics. People don't like to talk about the politics, but the fact is that in general, Democrats prefer carbon taxing, and they prefer to spend the money on climate justice and renewables. Republicans generally prefer dollar incentives for carbon capture technology. And in fact, what's interesting about the carbon fee and dividend idea is, well, I'll talk about that in a second. But the problem is that the Democrats want to do one thing, the Republicans want to do another thing, so actually what happens is we do neither thing. And this is not a situation that we can live with forever or a lot longer. Carbon fee and dividend, which is the idea, there are two ideas I push. I've spent 3.5 years working on climate change. The first thing I figured out was I don't want to argue with deniers. I have other things to do with my time. And anything would be a better use of time than arguing with deniers. If you don't believe this, you don't want to believe this, and I'm not here to try to convince you of something you don't want to believe. But on the other hand, what I was really looking for, I'm a Democrat. I'm a Democrat activist liberal. I want to fight with Democrats. I want to fight with people who know that this is a real problem, but are wrong, not factually wrong. They're not wrong in their hearts. They're wrong in their heads about what is the proper thing to do to solve the problem. Well, over a decade ago, an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby, which is frustratingly nonpartisan from my point of view, Citizens Climate Lobby hatched the idea of carbon fee and dividend. And the way they proposed it is that they would tax carbon at $15 a ton and raise that tax $10 every year, forever. So in 20 years, it would be $215 a ton. Now, a couple of benchmarks here. $1 a ton is a penny a gallon. $15 a ton is 15 cents a gallon. $10 a ton per year is 10 cents more a gallon per year, if you're thinking about it in terms of gas at the pump. So that was their proposal. Then in February of 2017, a bunch of Republicans who were proud Republicans, led by Secretaries Baker and Schultz, created something called the Climate Leadership Council. And they proposed almost the same idea as Citizens Climate Lobby. But the way they said it is, we hate taxes. We're Republicans. But we also hate markets that are broken. And this is a broken market because there are costs in here which are not being accounted for and which we're all asked to pay for later. And that's not right. And so we as responsible Republicans want to tax these fossil fuels to cover that social cost of carbon. But because we're Republicans, we don't want to give the government the money and let them spend the money. So we're just going to give the money back in equal shares to everybody, which is exactly Citizens Climate Lobby's formula. Then there was another group that's formed since then called Americans for Carbon Dividends, which is hypothetically bipartisan. The thing about dividend is that it solves the problem that they haven't solved in France, right? You got all the people in France in the street screaming about the taxes on petrol. Why? Because the government keeps that money and spends it on things that some people like and some people don't. If you had the Climate Leadership Council formula is $40 a ton. $40 a ton is 40 cents a gallon. $40 a ton, the way they did the formula, which is full shares to adults and half shares to kids, would give $2,000 a year to a family of 4. $2,000 a year is $150 a month. So if you did this formula, it'd be $40 a ton, you would be, everybody in the room would be, every household would be getting a check for $150 a month. Would you spend that $150 a month? Well, if you lived in Manhattan, you sure wouldn't. Because if you live in small spaces and you don't drive a car, you're hardly going to pay this tax at all. And if you don't own several homes and fly once a week, you're probably going to be in the 70% of the people who actually make money on the dividend. And making money on the dividend is key, because the social cost of carbon is not $15 or $40. It may be $400 or $600. And the only way you're going to get it up to where it needs to go is to bribe 70% of the people to keep allowing you to raise the tax. And that's what carbon fee and dividend does. In Congress now, Congressman Ted Deutsch from the other side of the state has H.R. 763, which I urge everyone to write a letter to Buchanan and whoever else to support, which is essentially the Citizens Climate Lobby formula. There is also a cap and dividend, which is used the carbon cap formula, but refund as dividend. There's a bill like that in Congress. There are several variations with less than complete dividends. In other words, you can cut the baby in half. You can use half the money for dividends and half the money for climate justice. You can have any number of formulas you want. I'm in favor of full dividend because I'm in favor of the full bribe to raise the taxes. A couple of political lessons. Australia put in a carbon tax in 2012 with no dividend or no obvious refund, and within the next election, Labour was thrown out and they can't get back in. But Canada passed a tax and dividend for all the provinces that didn't have a carbon tax, and Trudeau got reelected. Well, why is that? Because they started mailing the quarterly dividend checks before the election. Makes a big difference, demonstrates the point. And it happens that certain Canadian provinces were exempt from the tax because they already had a plan. It happens that Quebec is in a cap and trade program with California. So this can even be done with groups getting together that aren't even in the same country. It happens British Columbia has had a carbon tax, and they do it with tax swaps. That's their way. So there are a variety of samples of how this can work right here in North America. So I mentioned this before about the trade-offs, that what the taxing provides more transparency and it's simpler to administer. The question about this is why now? Because Hansen said 315 was the danger when it was now 415. Because the true social cost of carbon is much higher than anybody dares to suggest. Because carbon fee and dividend supports raising the tax. Nuclear, that's my other pet project, is let's stop closing nuclear plants. If every time we close them, we burn more fossil fuel. This is crazy. And it's happening for me now in my local plant in Croton-on-Hudson, New York, where the Indian Point Power Plant provides 25% of New York's power, and the first plant's going to close this April 30th, and the second plant's going to close the following April 30th, and New York is going to emit 7 million tons of carbon that it doesn't emit now because do-gooders on my side of the aisle are in favor of closing Indian Point. This is education that we really have to do. And by the way, if we had a carbon tax, Indian Point wouldn't be closing. It's closing because the owner of the plant can't make any money. If the cost of fossil fuel energy were higher, then Indian Point would be making money. And that's all I got. I hope it was of use to you. Thank you.